What if one piece of equipment was enough to decide your fate long before the battle was over? Not your uniform. Not your rank. Just a weapon on your back that silently told the enemy exactly who you were and what you had done. On the Eastern Front of World War II, this weapon turned ordinary soldiers into marked men. And once they were identified, surrender was no longer a guarantee of survival. This is the untold story of SS Flamethrower operators on the Eastern Front. Not myths. Not exaggerations. But a brutal reality shaped by fear, hatred, and a cycle of retaliation that spiraled far beyond the rules of conventional warfare. To understand why these men faced such extreme consequences, you first have to understand how the Eastern Front was different from every other battlefield of the war. This was not a conflict fought with restraint. It was a war of annihilation, driven by ideology, revenge, and survival. Both sides believed they were fighting for existence itself. And in that environment, certain weapons carried a meaning far beyond their military purpose. Flamethrowers were one of those weapons. In Western Europe, flamethrowers were mostly tactical tools. They were used to clear bunkers, trenches, or fortified positions when conventional weapons failed. Their use was limited and often controlled. But on the Eastern Front, especially within certain SS units, flamethrowers became something else entirely. They were psychological weapons. Instruments meant not only to defeat the enemy, but to terrify them into submission. SS divisions such as Das Reich Totenkopf integrated flamethrowers into their combat engineer units early in the war. These operators were trained to advance alongside infantry during assaults on fortified Soviet positions, urban strongholds, and partisan-held areas. The presence of a flamethrower could end resistance quickly. In theory, it saved time and reduced friendly casualties. In practice, it left a deep and lasting impression on anyone who witnessed its use. Soviet soldiers learned very quickly what those fuel tanks meant. A flamethrower operator was not just another enemy infantryman. He represented destruction that felt personal. Entire positions could be rendered uninhabitable in seconds. Escape routes vanished. Defensive lines collapsed. Survivors remembered the sound, the heat, and the panic long after the fighting ended. And memory turned into hatred. By 1942, Soviet field manuals and training programs had begun to address flamethrower threats directly. Soldiers were taught how to identify operators instantly. The bulky tanks. The distinctive posture. The careful movements of someone carrying volatile fuel. Flamethrower operators became priority targets. Machine gunners were instructed to engage them first. Snipers were trained to watch specifically for their silhouettes. This was not random battlefield behavior. It was learned survival. For the SS flamethrower operator, this meant life expectancy dropped dramatically. Casualty rates in some units exceeded 60% during major engagements. At battles like Kharkov and Kursk, flamethrower teams were often eliminated within hours of entering combat. Some never made it close enough to use their weapons at all. SS commanders were aware of this. Yet they continued deploying flamethrowers because when they worked decisively. A single operator could neutralize a defensive position that might otherwise cost dozens of attackers. From a purely tactical standpoint, it made sense. From a human standpoint, it created consequences no one could fully control. Every time a flamethrower was used, it reinforced a growing belief among Soviet troops that these operators were not ordinary soldiers. They were seen as enforcers of terror rather than participants in combat. This distinction mattered. Because on the Eastern Front, perception often determined fate. German soldiers captured by the Red Army already faced harsh conditions. But SS troops faced something even worse. And within the SS, flamethrower operators occupied the lowest rung of mercy. There was no official written order declaring what should happen to captured flamethrower operators. Nothing you would find neatly filed in an archive. Instead, there was an understanding that spread through Red Army units organically, reinforced by experience and shared stories. Some weapons crossed an invisible line. Flamethrowers were one of them. By the time of Stalingrad, this understanding had hardened into an unwritten rule. SS combat engineers using flamethrowers were heavily involved in urban fighting during the battle. When Soviet forces finally regained ground, they encountered the aftermath left behind. Burned defensive positions. Destroyed shelters. Evidence of close, brutal fighting. The resentment this generated cannot be overstated. From this point forward, flamethrower operators were no longer treated as ordinary prisoners of war. Their equipment alone was enough to seal their fate. Word spread quickly. If you carried a flamethrower and were captured, your chances of survival were almost non-existent. The SS noticed the change too. By 1943 and 1944, many flamethrower operators attempted to discard their equipment during retreats. Fuel tanks were abandoned. Ignition units thrown away. Operators tried to blend back into regular infantry formations. But this was harder than it sounds. Residual fuel stains on uniforms. The smell that lingered. Unit assignments that betrayed their role. Soviet troops knew what to look for. Some operators succeeded in hiding their identity. Many did not. This growing reality began to affect morale inside SS units. Flamethrower duty was no longer seen as prestigious or heroic. In some formations, it became a punishment assignment. Others used it to test soldiers accused of hesitation or fear. The logic was cruel but simple. Either the man would prove himself, or he would not survive long enough to be a problem. By the final years of the war, even new recruits understood what being assigned a flamethrower meant. It was not just dangerous in combat. It was dangerous afterward. Surrender was no longer an option you could rely on. And yet, the SS continued to deploy these weapons. Because on the Eastern Front, restraint had long since vanished. What makes this story even more unsettling is that many of the men carrying these flamethrowers were barely adults. Some were 17 or 18 years old. Poorly trained. Poorly informed. Thrown into a role that guaranteed they would be hated by an enemy already hardened by years of brutal warfare. They learned the truth quickly, usually too late to escape it. By 1945, the reputation of SS flamethrower operators was firmly established on both sides. Soviet troops knew exactly who they were. SS units knew exactly what capture meant. And the cycle continued until the very end of the war. But what happened after capture did not end on the battlefield. In the final months of World War II, and even after Germany surrendered, SS flamethrower operators continued to disappear. Some were identified during processing. Others were recognized by veterans who remembered faces, voices, or unit markings. A few managed to survive by hiding their past, living under constant fear that the truth would surface. Very few succeeded. In Part 2, we will examine what happened to the rare individuals who survived. How some escaped immediate retribution. How others lived decades under false identities. And how the legacy of this weapon followed them long after the war ended. Because for SS flamethrower operators, the war did not stop when the fighting did. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, most soldiers believed the worst was over. For SS flamethrower operators, that assumption could be fatal. The end of combat did not mean the end of danger. In many cases, it marked the beginning of a far more uncertain chapter, one defined by fear, secrecy, and disappearance. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into Germany in 1945, they captured hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. Processing centers were overwhelmed. Records were incomplete. Chaos ruled. In theory, prisoners were sorted by unit, rank, and role. In reality, identification often depended on the memories of Soviet soldiers who had survived years of brutal fighting. And memory, especially on the Eastern Front, was sharp. SS flamethrower operators stood out. Even without their equipment, many carried signs of their former role. Burn marks on uniforms. Unusual injuries to hands and forearms. Knowledge of specialized equipment they could not easily explain away. Most damning of all were unit records. SS combat engineer battalions were well known, and Soviet interrogators paid close attention to anyone connected to them. Those identified as flamethrower operators were often removed from the general prisoner population. Official paperwork rarely recorded what happened next. Files simply noted that the individual was no longer present. Fellow prisoners understood what that meant and learned not to ask questions. This created an atmosphere of quiet terror inside the camps. Men who had once carried flamethrowers became obsessed with hiding their past. Some altered their stories repeatedly. Others memorized false service records and practiced them until they sounded natural. A few destroyed their identification entirely and hoped the chaos would protect them. For a small number, it worked. There are documented cases of SS flamethrower operators who survived Soviet captivity by convincing authorities they had served in non-combat roles. Radio operators, clerks, supply drivers. One man reportedly survived nearly 2 decades in labor camps after claiming he had worked in communications. He spoke Russian fluently, which helped him avoid suspicion. But even after release, he lived with constant fear that someone from his past would recognize him. Survival came at a psychological cost. Many of these men never spoke about their wartime experiences. Not to family. Not to friends. Some changed their names. Others emigrated, hoping distance would erase memory. But memory proved stubborn. The Eastern Front created bonds and grudges that did not fade easily. In the Soviet Union, veterans remembered flamethrowers vividly. Interviews conducted decades later show remarkable consistency. While time softened many wartime judgments, attitudes toward SS flamethrower operators remained harsh. Veterans did not describe what happened to them with regret. They described it as consequence. To them, flamethrowers symbolized a deliberate choice to use terror as a weapon. Whether the operator volunteered or was assigned did not matter. The act itself defined the man. This distinction explains why regular German flamethrower operators sometimes survived capture while SS operators almost never did. The difference was not the weapon alone. It was how, where, and why it was used. SS units were associated with ideological warfare, punitive operations, and civilian suffering. Flamethrowers, when used in that context, became inseparable from those actions. After the war, Soviet military prosecutors investigated SS war crimes extensively. Flamethrower use appeared repeatedly in case files, particularly in operations involving civilians and urban fighting. But very few actual flamethrower operators ever stood trial. The reason was simple. Most were already dead. This absence created a strange historical gap. The crimes were documented. The units were known. The weapons were catalogued. But the men themselves had largely vanished. Historians attempting to trace their fates found silence where records should have been. That silence tells its own story. By the 1960s and 1970s, as Cold War tensions eased slightly and international travel increased, old memories resurfaced. There are credible reports of former SS flamethrower operators being recognized decades later by Soviet veterans who had emigrated or traveled abroad. These encounters rarely ended peacefully. In several cases, authorities intervened before violence occurred. In others, the individuals quietly disappeared from public life soon afterward. Fear followed these men to the end. What makes this history particularly tragic is how many flamethrower operators were barely adults when assigned the role. Late in the war, the SS increasingly relied on conscripts and teenagers. Many received minimal training and even less explanation. They were told to carry the weapon. They were not told what it would mean if they survived long enough to be captured. By the time they understood, there was no turning back. Some attempted to refuse assignments. Others deserted. A few deliberately placed themselves in situations they knew they would not survive. Soviet after-action reports mention instances where flamethrower operators fought until exhaustion rather than risk capture. Not out of loyalty, but out of fear of what awaited them. By 1945, SS flamethrower units were shrinking rapidly. Equipment shortages played a role, but morale was the real problem. Everyone knew the reputation. Everyone knew the consequences. The weapon that once promised battlefield advantage had become a curse. After the war, flamethrowers gradually disappeared from European armies. Their tactical usefulness remained, but their symbolic weight had become too heavy. They were associated with some of the darkest memories of 20th century warfare. Even discussing their use made veterans uncomfortable. The story of SS flamethrower operators is not one of heroism or villainy alone. It is a warning. A demonstration of how certain choices in war erase the line between combatant and symbol. Once that line is crossed, mercy becomes optional. And survival depends on luck more than skill. On the Eastern Front, weapons were not just tools. They were messages. And the message carried by a flamethrower was one the enemy never forgot. History often focuses on generals, strategies, and battles. But sometimes, the fate of a war can be seen in the life of a single soldier and the weapon he carried. 4 SS Flamethrower operators, that weapon followed them from the battlefield into captivity, into exile, and into memory. Long after the flames went out. If you want more stories that explore the hidden consequences of war, the choices soldiers made, and the prices they paid, stay with us. Because history is not just what happened. It is what followed.